Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this pre-DNC event on women, veterans, and politics. I'm Mieke Eoyang. I'm the Senior Vice President for National Security here at Third Way. I am very honored to be joined by Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill and Gina Ortiz Jones to talk about this really important moment in politics. We've had a whole series of conversations about what's going on in the 2020 political scene, and we're really honored that everyone could participate. We'll take audience questions as we go, so people can feel free to pop those into the chat as they come up, and we'll turn to audience questions in a bit. But first, I just wanted to say a few words about why we wanted to have this conversation and why this is a real moment for women veterans. And we saw both last cycle and this cycle a ton of energy and enthusiasm around women veterans running for Congress and getting involved in our politics. And it feels like we're in a real moment here. And I'm someone who has worked in national security and on women in national security for most of my career. And one of the things that when we think about leadership, right, the idea of veterans and warriors as leaders is something ancient in our society, going all the way back to Plato's guardians. And this idea is those who defend the nation, who are in a special place to lead us. And historically, for a long time, we've thought of that military as predominantly men. But over the course of our lifetimes, the role of women in the military has really dramatically changed. Well, yes, we had women who served in important ways in World War II. It's really only been over the course of our lifetime that our nation has really embraced and authorized and given space for women to serve alongside men in all the same roles. Beginning in the 1970s, when we first started seeing women officially coming into the military and not just as a separate service, into the 1980s, when women first started attending the military academies, our most elite military institutions, into the 90s, where women started being permitted to serve in combat roles alongside men on combat vessels in both surface ships and for aviation. And it's at that moment where the women that that are joining us here today started their military service. And what we've seen in the military is that those who serve in this way have a special role both in the military and in our nation. And so I wanted to have these two amazing leaders talk to us today about the role of women and how they see the 2020 race unfolding for women veterans. So first we have Congresswoman Mikie Sherrill, who graduated from the Naval Academy in 1994 and was in the first class of women who were permitted to, after they lifted the combat exclusion in aviation. And I believe, Congresswoman, you were the first woman in your class to fly combat helicopters, is that right?
No, that's not quite right. I was in the first class to graduate with the combat restrictions lifted.
And you're a helicopter pilot and you flew in the Middle East, and then are also a Russia expert, which has been, I'm sure, very both enlightening and infuriating over the past few years, before becoming a federal prosecutor. And then Gina Ortiz Jones, who is joining us from Texas, who is running for Congress in Texas 23, which I believe is the longest border district in Texas. Is that correct?
Well, longest border district, period. 800
in
miles.
the United States.
Yeah, a third of the U.S.-Mexico border. Yep.
Amazing, huge district to cover. And Gina served as an Air Force intelligence officer and also in the U.S. Trade Rep's office until the beginning of the Trump administration, when she left to return to Texas to run for Congress. So I guess I just want to start with a question for each of you, which is basically, how did you decide to go into the military? What was your call to military service? Congresswoman, why don't we start with you?
Sure. I had actually wanted to go into the military from the time I was in the 5th grade, believe it or not. My grandfather was a pilot in World War II and told stories. He had a passion for flying. He had a passion for aircraft, and it seems to kind of skip around my family. There are certain kids in each family that really are attracted to that, and I I remember going to the Wright Pat Air Force Museum where they had a B-24, and he would take us there. He was from Cincinnati, take us over there. And, you know, an hour into it, my sisters would be like, tell Grandpa we want to leave. Tell him you're done. And I'm like, I'm not done. I love this. You know, so it certainly, you know, for some people that you just have this innate passion for some of that. And his stories of serving the country in World War II and then growing up during the Cold War, I think just reinforced my desire to fight for our ideals, because the difference between what we stood for in this country and what the Soviet Union stood for was so stark that it just, I think it was easy to communicate that in a way that I often feel like our generation hasn't done a very good job in communicating that to people post-Cold War. But I really had that strong desire to serve. So my father said, well, I don't know if the Naval Academy takes women. And I think to just give you a sense of how open the world is for young women and how we have to do our part to keep those opportunities open, I remember saying to him, well, that's okay, I'll figure it out. You know, the world really is so wide when you're young, and to think of in any way shutting that down, I think is hard to contemplate. So certainly they had allowed women. I went into the Naval Academy, but to give you a sense of the times, the 1992 tale had happened. So this was a huge issue in the United States Navy about sexual harassment, one of our first big reckonings with that. And it was shortly thereafter that, as you mentioned, Mieke, they opened up combat to women. And I remember getting a brief because I wanted to go aviation. And naval aviation includes Marine Corps aviation. So, and the Naval Academy graduates Marines. And I remember a Marine giving us this brief on opening up the Navy combat, naval air to combat roles to women. And I remember a woman in my class saying, well, does that include Marine Corps combat roles? And she said, oh, I think so. And sure enough, it did. But I mean, you know, this attitude was prevalent throughout the forces. So, but I directly attribute opening up those combat roles to the fact that you now see Elaine Luria, who graduated at roughly the same time in the 90s, and myself in Congress, and Amy McGrath running for Congress. I think just opening up those roles to women and opening up what we could do, I think has led to what we see today as kind of women whose time has come. So we see Gina running, we see Chrissy Houlihan, and then our national security women who traveled and have been at war, like Alyssa Slotkin and Abigail Spanberger. So I think opening up those roles have directly led now to this great group of national security women fighting for elected office.
Yeah, that it's so true that it's created so many more opportunities. Gina, you entered military service as well, and you went through the ROTC program. Tell us about why you chose to do that, but also you faced an additional challenge with your military service under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. And maybe tell us a little bit about, you know, why you chose this path, you know, given the challenges that there were at the time.
Well, thank you again for hosting this conversation. It's always nice to see Mikie, even if it's just virtually. You know, I was raised by a single mom, and my mom came to this country over 40 years ago. She graduated from the #1 university in the Philippines, but came here as a domestic helper. That was the opportunity that presented itself, and she jumped at it because, you know, like so many people on this planet, they know from a very young age that in order to live their best possible life, they'll probably have to leave their home country. And for many people, that means trying to come to our very special country. So, you know, you can see in that the sense of responsibility, sense of duty that my mom instilled in my sister and I to give back to a country that gave us so much. So there's that piece of it. There's also the fact that, you know, when my uncle joined the Navy from the Philippines, actually, he could only be just a handful of things to include a steward or a cook or an electrician, very limited opportunities. But the Navy, the military was always understood as an opportunity, again, to give back to a country that had given you so much, but also an opportunity to be part of the middle class, right? And so my mom raised my younger sister and I by herself. And so that ROTC scholarship was was really a godsend to be able to allow me to get an education and serve my country, right? And so, but you're right, I will never forget one of the very first things I had to do at Boston University, even before my first class, was sign a piece of paper that said I will not engage in homosexual behavior. And so, you know, my opportunity to get an education, my opportunity to get to serve my country, my opportunity to die for my country, if need be, all that goes away if they find out that I'm gay. And so for me, national security will always mean, yes, ships and tanks and airplanes, but it also will always mean the pipeline of talent to serve our country and how we have to ensure that anybody ready and willing to serve their country has the opportunity to do so.
Yeah, that policy is, I mean, so frustrating to me personally. My father had actually run a small DoD research organization called PERSEREC, which in the 80s was the first DoD entity to recommend to the department that they should lift their restriction on homosexual conduct because it was unjust and unfair. And he lost his job over that. But it is amazing to see the progress that has come in diversity, in acceptance, in opening up those opportunities in the military. And I'd love to hear from the two of you both how you've seen the institution change over time from when you started to where we are now, in terms of its how the culture has shifted with the people who've come in. Gina, why don't we start with you? Because, you know, over your time, policies have changed and become more
absolutely
open.
You know, I separated in 2016, but I still worked in national security, primarily with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and so saw it from a different angle, but certainly saw the exact same changes that you're talking about. And so we've absolutely come a long way, but I think there's certainly a long way to go. And you know, for example, you know, the recent report about what happened to Specialist Vanessa Guillen here at Fort Hood, just up the street from me, shows you, you know, certainly that was an unfortunate tragedy in a number of ways. Obviously, this young, brave soldier lost her life, but, you know, that was also a failure of leadership in so many ways, right? The fact that she did not have the confidence in her chain of command to report that and then have the trust that they would take that seriously. So, you know, it's great that women are now able to serve to their full potential in one way because some of these restrictions have been removed, but we certainly have a long way to go when it comes to leadership, accountability, transparency, to make sure that everyone, regardless of gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, can fully serve in the military to their full potential.
Yeah, I'd agree with Gina. We certainly have come a long way. I remember when I was at the Naval Academy, we had the whole brigade together to hear from the Chief of Naval Operations. And a woman stood up and said, when will women be on subs? And he said, not in my lifetime. Well, now, of course, women can serve on subs. We had a member of the LGBT community stand up and say, when will you have the courage to allow gay people to serve? And they had to station security outside his door in the barracks just for asking the question. And so certainly that has changed. But I guess I'd also say that not enough has changed when we see the rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment, and really the unwillingness in some quarters to address this head on. So I was just we were just working on the markup for the National Defense Authorization Act, and Jackie Spear, who's been working in these areas for a very long time, and is the chairwoman of the MILPERS committee, subcommittee on House Armed Services. You know, she said she wanted to put, and this is just, if you know, this is such a small step. She just wanted to put, because the service academies, the numbers of the service academies of women being assaulted are really bad. And so she simply wanted to put a special prosecutor in place for the service academies on a test case basis, just for a limited period of time, to see if that would help, to see if that would work. Which seems like such a small step. And this is a problem that we've spent millions of dollars on, study after study after study, trying to come up with the systems to make sure that we don't have a situation like Vanessa Guillen, who's afraid to come forward and report this. So she suggested this, and one of the Republicans said, well, I think we could study this. And so I said, you know, I spoke on the amendment and I said, that's pretty unacceptable. You know, here we have people that I'm sending. I'm personally, as a congressperson, nominating people to go to the academies, and these rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment are unacceptable, and I feel personally responsible for the people that I send there. And the fact that we still have these rates that look a lot like the rates that we saw 30 years ago when I entered is simply unacceptable. And then he said, and I thought a very condescending way, well, we're going to hear a lot of emotional stories. But then Elaine Luria said, there are 2,000 women on a chat room talking about sexual assault and sexual harassment in the academies. And she went on. And I think what was so helpful was that these weren't emotional stories. These are lived experiences. Elena and I, and I'm sure Gina, sadly, we know people that have been assaulted and harassed. I've been harassed. I mean, we know what that looks like from the inside. So you can't simply, these aren't simply, oh, I heard that, or I read an article that. These are stories that we know personally happen, and we know why they happen, and we know how they happen. And I think having people at the table to address these issues is so critically important. And I saw it in action because of all the Democratic amendments, that was the one we got the most crossover on. After Elaine and I spoke, 7 Republicans crossed over and voted for that amendment, which I thought was really important. So these are, like I said, we've seen a lot of progress. We need to see more progress.
I mean, it really demonstrates the difference.
One more thing on that. Yeah, such a critical part of this conversation, I think, is you know, there's not enough people. Certainly, well, one, we've got fewer and fewer percentage of the population that serves, and so they don't have that experience. And so when you talk about things like military readiness, right, and the effect that these things have on military readiness and the lack of trust and the threat to good order and discipline, right? People don't understand how these higher rates within the military are completely opposite of what you would understand on in an organization that, again, prides itself on good order and discipline. So there's something uniquely different in these institutions that we need to take seriously. And I think it requires, and as many folks like Mikie and others are already leading on, thinking and talking about it in the context of military readiness. It's so critical. And it's not only the women that are serving, but I mean, let's again go back to Vanessa Guillen, right? She wanted to serve since she was 10 years old. And so it's very important that we are not deterring people from thinking that they can serve their country in uniform because they're not going to be taken seriously or treated with dignity and respect. I mean, that is so far from the institution that Mikie and I served, and we can improve that, but I think we've got to just be very honest about the effect that sexual assault, sexual harassment have on military readiness and the pipeline of talent into the service.
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways so encouraging to hear that Republicans are crossing their party line to support these amendments when they're offered by women veterans who are speaking about their truth. I remember early on in my career, I was working for Pat Schroeder when we had a series of sexual assault scandals at Aberdeen, Maryland. And the political response from the Republicans on the Armed Services Committee at the time was, this is a problem because we have men and women serving side by side and going through training together. And if we just segregated the men and women, we wouldn't have this problem. As if, you know, this separation, segregation is the answer, and that, you know, people were seeing it as a problem of diversity as opposed to a violent interpersonal crime. And so it's very encouraging to see, you know, while it may not feel like we've gotten far enough, that there has been progress since then. But Gina, you raise a really interesting point about the number of people who have military experience is declining, and fewer Americans understand what that's like. How do you see yourself as a bridge between Americans who don't have that military service and your own experience? How do the two of you in your political, you know, as you serve your constituents, help people understand that difference?
Yeah, you know, and it's funny, I'm very fortunate to have grown up in Military City, USA. So I probably have to do a little bit less explaining than in other parts of the country. But I think what it does is does really highlight the importance of explaining, you know, the difference between, for example, you know, DHS civilian personnel in military fatigues, or what look to be military fatigues, versus, you know, what our men and women in uniform are actually tasked to do. And so I think it actually really heightens the importance of Congress's oversight role, right, to make sure that people are acting with adequate authorities, and you're not blurring the lines between these various institutions that, to your point, few people are really unfamiliar with the distinctions about, you know, DHS versus CBP versus the military. And I think it's also, you know, important, you know, certainly for the media, right? As we talk about, as you use language, just even something as innocuous as troops, right? I mean, that has a very, like, people have an understanding of what that means. And so if you've got the media calling folks, civilian personnel in military uniforms, troops, and the vast majority of Americans, again, are not super familiar with the distinction, then you're coloring that engagement in that environment, and that situation in a way that is not helpful to either civilian personnel serving in that capacity or to the military. And so I think what's critical, though, is talking about, you know, the importance of the military institution writ large. One, as an apolitical institution, right, to ensure that that civ-mil relationship, which this entire experiment is based on, is protected, and that's a responsibility of military members serving, of their civilian leaders, as well as, I think, of veterans, right, to help people explain, those who haven't served, why it's so important. We have leaders that are going to ask the tough questions and make sure we're only sending our men and women into harm's way when absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
You know, as you look at the rates of military, it's really concerning, I think, to those of us who've served, because we're worried about becoming this discrete warrior class. And that's bad for the population of the United States not to understand what it is to go to war and what it is to send people to war and what that means and why that should always be a last resort. It's also bad for the military to not have that engagement and not be from all sectors of our society, to kind of be stovepiped and insular. So when you look at Congress, you see, you know, back when I was born in the early 70s, about 70% of Congress was made up of veterans. Now it's about 20%. And I really think that impacts a lot of the thinking. I'll also tell you that what I think is lost without national service is this integration of our country. I can't tell you how many veterans I've spoken to that the first time they interacted, and these are often World War II or Vietnam veterans, the first time they met someone who was Jewish or Black was in the service. The first time they interacted with someone from New Jersey was when they went to serve. The first time they'd ever been overseas or seen what it meant to be an American and what democracy meant, because they saw what it meant when you didn't have freedom of speech, when you didn't have the same rights, when women weren't treated very well, was when they were in the military. So many of these experiences have made you know, Gina and I, who we are, and I think have given us a very broad appreciation and deep love of this country, but also a deep understanding of so many different types of people. You know, I left high school. I went to the Naval Academy, where there are people from every state in the nation, and some people's parents were serving overseas, so they were overseas. I then graduated. I was trained in Florida and Texas, two places I never lived. And then after that, went to serve in Southern Virginia, and then went to serve overseas in Bahrain and the Arabian Gulf. I went to serve in Italy. I went to serve in London, and then kind of was in detachments all over the world. So these really, I think, inform my views and really inform, I think, my deep belief in the diversity and the reliance on diversity of this nation and what it brings to us, and my deep belief in our democracy, something that I just can't help but feel too many people take for granted. And as we're losing ground right now, as we're seeing unmarked cars picking people up off the street when they're protesting, as we're seeing the erosion of our rights right now, I can't help but feel that if people had seen the way other countries look, they might be a lot more jealous of their rights and privileges here at home.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I wish everyone could hear you talk about the military in that way, in terms of like the cohesiveness and the sort of the ways in which people can, you know, engage with each other, and the importance that it has for diversity, and also, you know, as an economic, as an economic benefit to people, that so many people, as Gina has talked about, right, entering and becoming part of the middle class because the military is able to help them pay for school or give them training to a real career. It really, it's wonderful to hear. But we also see with some folks on the far left, a real sort of suspicion of the military, and a lot of people who haven't had that experience in military service. As you engage politically with your colleagues in Congress or on the campaign trail with folks who have that, how do you engage with them about the value of military service? People who maybe haven't experienced it or have suspicion or concern based on, you know, what's happened in Iraq and in other places.
Well, I think, you know, so many of us are concerned. When we entered Iraq, when I was serving, I never could have dreamed that we would still be serving there today, that we would still be engaged there today. We have these forever wars going on, and I think that concerns us all, left, right, and center. And so I think there is room to be concerned. I think when the Defense Department can't pass an audit, it's sometimes hard to express why we are spending in certain areas when we haven't seen that. So I think there are concerns that are raised that are valid concerns, but I think too often there are some people that want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That if there are these issues, that the answer isn't to, you know, not support modernizing our military, not to support ensuring that we have a competitive edge against Russia and against China so that we can promote democracy abroad, but keep the peace. I feel like I've talked more about the Naval Academy because we're talking about the Navy than I have ever, but I keep coming back to it because there's, you know, I just remember our class motto is Ex Trident Pax, through sea power peace, you know, like making sure that we can project a strong and mighty military to ensure that people don't think it might make sense to engage in war with us. And that's worked very well. And I think that's something that we want to keep in mind on. Now, we might want to change the parameters of that, what that looks like. But I do think we want to be able to promote our democratic values and ideals across the world. I do think we want to keep sea lanes open in the South China Sea for commerce. I do think we want to promote other countries that are nascent democracies. I do think we want to promote free and fair elections. So these are all critical values that the military can help oversee. And too many times the conversation, I think, becomes, loses some of the value and insight. I think serving in the military can really be one of the great bases for American citizenship. I think serving in the military can really help young people understand our values and what it means and how critical our nation is in the world. And I think sometimes that message is lost a little bit when we're talking about some of the things that I think we really need as a country to come to grips with. How are we going to get out of Afghanistan? How are we going to end the war in Iraq? What are we going to do to promote our values? And what does the future of our military look like?
Mikie makes a really wonderful point, which is helping people understand the importance of American leadership, right? There's a difference between a strong military institution and the importance of American leadership and getting anything done in this world, right? And so for folks that haven't served, aren't super familiar with the military, they're also then not going to understand why something like NATO is so important, right? And NATO then is not just Article 5, right? It's also Article 2, which is a values-based organization and military alliance. And so I think, helping folks understand the importance of American leadership, what that actually allows us to do and how that allows us to contribute to international security is so important. And so when folks, politicize issues and then try to wrap it in national security, I think that contributes to some of the suspicion on the left, right? I mean, when you've got this, and then when you have, frankly, folks on the other side that are too willing to be complicit in that conversation, right? I mean, if you're gonna call into place a fake national emergency so you can steal from the military to go build this wasteful wall, right? So I think the times in which the auspices of national security are used, and then to see the ways in which sometimes that money can be wasted, fraud, waste, and abuse, right? Anyone in DoD very much knows that phrase. Then that I think contributes to folks' understanding and wanting to better understand how can we do this in a smarter way? And, this is something that we've certainly talked about in this district because, it does challenge people's understanding. For example, San Antonio, military city USA, right? Military city USA, we're the 7th largest city in the country, but we've got the highest rate of poverty of the top 25 cities in the country. So how can you be military city USA and have that? Right? How can you have the largest cyber presence outside of Washington, D.C. and not be able to close the digital divide on the south side of San Antonio, right? I think these are the things that people are trying to grapple with, and rightfully so that we do have, certainly our economic security, but also national security. Those two things we've got to be thinking about more holistically.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a really good point about, the military, in the military, you deal with so many of the different issues, right? Healthcare, cybersecurity, housing, compensation, all of these things. In many ways, it's a microcosm of society. But there are ways in which the military does things where they are sort of very intentional about how they think about things, providing housing, providing allowances for subsistence and education and things like that. What lessons do you guys draw from your military experience that you think we could do better if we were to try and learn some of those lessons in society writ large? What lessons does the military, or what things does the military do well that you think we should probably do them better in America?
Well, I think it's, oh, go ahead, Gina.
I was going to say, I think the military, is second to none when it comes to leadership development and the ways in which that's a thread in every service member's career, whether they're enlisted or an officer. And there's always that, that constant emphasis on it where they try to, encourage that to make sure that you are an effective leader, right? A leader's number one job is always to develop more leaders, right? And so if that's ingrained in you every single day, then that certainly, contributes to how you serve, how you then develop those underneath you. And then certainly, look, the oath to the Constitution, right? This supporting and defending the Constitution. It's not a person, right? It's not a man. It's not a political party. And that oath that is unwavering, that stays with many, right? Even after they hang up their uniform, is something that I wish we could, similarly instill in folks. It's hard to do that, right? If you're not serving, because that's when you take the oath. There are certainly civilian opportunities to do that. I took it when I served in the executive office of the president. But, I think those two things, the leadership development, the emphasis on developing good leaders, and ensuring that, we have this unwavering oath to the Constitution.
Congresswoman, you had some thoughts there.
Yeah, so it's so interesting because the military is so different in so many ways from your sort of normal civilian job. As I like to say, one of the things you see in the military is you can't hire an admiral off the street. So the reason that the military is just, I think, so focused on leadership and developing people and investing in people is because, you graduate, you have a class of ensigns and that's all you've got, right? Like you're not going to be picking people up off, as you go through the ranks. You've got those ensigns, your pool of ensigns, that's where your future leaders are coming from, like it or not. And so you have to concentrate on how you develop leadership, how you train people, what the opportunities for training are. And I think that's something as a society we need to look at in a better way. How do we find those opportunities for people to continue growing, to continue training, to continue opportunities, to have opportunities as they grow throughout their careers? And then the other thing is kind of along those same lines, because you have to work from that pool of people, you really have to invest in good healthcare. You have to invest in childcare. You have to help with family services, because you have to make sure that you're providing an opportunity for people to stay in the military. And quite frankly, if you have someone serving in the military that doesn't have good childcare, there's a good chance they're going to say, you know what, I'm going to go. I've got to do something else. Or if there are healthcare problems and people can get better healthcare elsewhere, and there rarely are. It's hard to find better healthcare sometimes than what's offered in our military, but they get out. And so I think that's something that as a larger society, we need to be a little more thoughtful about how we are providing these opportunities for people. And then we're providing the services, because I think the thing about the military that's so helpful is it takes the long view. So when it's looking at those ensigns, it's thinking about admirals. And unfortunately, too many times, especially, you know, when I think about women's roles in the workforce, I think too many companies take the short view. And I think sometimes women shortchange themselves because they're taking the short view. So they're thinking, you know, gosh, the cost of healthcare is so high and I don't know how I'm going to do it. And it's so difficult that I'm going to remove myself now. And then they go down the road and they find, gosh, it's, you know, now I you know, if I just somehow kept kind of a foot in employment, I feel like, you know, I would have been more ready to re-enter full-time down the road. And I think companies need to make those calculations too, because it's not, you know, it's not just the next couple of years where women are maybe having kids or, you know, having some needs at home. It's the long haul. It's you know, these great women who are the CEOs, the future CEOs of companies that maybe for a couple of years aren't going to be, you know, 24/7 in the office.
Yeah, I mean, that is so profound to think about it as, you know, people are not disposable. People, you have to invest in them and you have to grow them from the beginning. It's not like, you know, so much of the gig economy where it's like, well, you just work for me for your, you know, tips or hourly and like, otherwise you're not my problem. It's like you really, in the military, you own the whole person. That is such a profound difference in the way that you think about people. It's really fascinating. We only have a few minutes left and this wouldn't be a third way event if I didn't ask you guys about politics. And both of you are running in districts that were previously held by Republicans and previously held by men. And we see this a lot where women veterans are being tapped to take on these races that are, you know, deep red and, you know, traditionally male dominated areas. Why do you think that is, that women veterans are doing so well in these kinds of races? Gina, we'll start with you since you are in the middle of this fight right now.
Sure. And I scared Will Hurd out of this race. So now it's an open seat in a district that Hillary won. Well, I think what's important for anyone running, like regardless of what gender, right, is not forgetting who tapped you to do this. And who tapped you to do this are the people in this district. And, you know, they want to know that you're going to, you know, their issues, you know, you're going to fight for their issues and make sure that we, you know, improve the situation that we're in. I think people are also recognizing that we can do much better than what we've got now. And what we're living through now is not just the result of one person's bad decisions, right? There's also a cadre of complicity that has led us to the moment that we're in. And so, you know, we're talking about the bread and butter issues that people care about. Certainly we can talk about, again, national security and the military and whatnot, because again, this is Military City, USA. But we can also, so we talk in this district, not only about the president, but also about the commander-in-chief and how he's failed in so many ways. But this is a district where the number one issue is healthcare, and you know, I do at times, you know, have to apply that national security lens, and because in Texas you can't help but do so, right? Texas, the most uninsured state in the country, but we also have 1 in 10 kids in the country that calls Texas home, right? So that in itself could present a national security challenge, given the outsized effect that we have on the academic preparedness of our young people, the sheer health of the country. So I think it's been helpful to, one, obviously focus on what voters care about, you know, the things that I fight for, expanding, protecting the ACA, and then helping folks understand, look, if we don't address this, if we're not serious about getting these things under control, this is what it looks like. And then to your point, pointing to, you know, the country, I've served in countries where women and minorities are targeted. I've served in countries where government's disregard for conflict of interest has hollowed those countries out. And I've seen what happens when good people don't stand up. And, you know, that's ultimately what got me in this race, to make sure my community was well represented. So, you know, that's what we look forward to doing. So I think it's that authenticity, bringing all of your lived experiences to the forefront and showing how you're going to fight for this district.
So,
you know, I think it wasn't immediately obvious after 2016 that women of any stripe would be good candidates. But I saw something different going on in my district. So many women were getting engaged. So many women were really upset. They were attending the Women's March in Washington. They were arranging information sessions on our government, and 300 or 400 people would attend them just to get engaged. People had this drive to get engaged. And yet, when I say it wasn't immediately obvious, So I'm seeing this in my district. I'm seeing this passion women are bringing to the table. And yet I'm hearing from national people, well, women aren't good candidates. Look what happened to Hillary. Women can't win. Look what happened to Hillary. You know, and so it was this dichotomy. And I think what comes in from some of the national service candidates is this idea that, well, I'm stepping up to serve the country. I think there's a need here, and I believe in this country. And it's not necessarily about winning or losing. It's about standing up for my country and my values, something I've always done. And I remember Amy McGrath getting asked, well, you know, people don't think you can win, and why are you running? And she said, well, if I don't run, who will? Like this sense of responsibility that we have to talk about these values, win or lose, we have to stand up because this is our job. This has always been our job, and to put this country first. And yet, again, the women were in my community so engaged and such a powerful force. And I think why specifically the national security women have done so well in some ways is because, you know, Gina kind of pointed to it with authenticity. I think before 2016, it was difficult to run an authentic campaign as a woman because the things that resonated with people in your district, talking about being in car line or soccer practice or being a mom, didn't sound like leadership. It didn't sound tough enough. It didn't sound like you were going to take on the job. But what the national security background gave to all of us is this resume that showed that we in fact were tough enough. And I do remember somebody saying, you know, I was at a small group meeting, so I wasn't giving my stump speech. I wasn't, you know, being loud and proud and, you know, this is what I'm running for. I was just sitting and talking to some people, and someone said afterwards, well, you were kind of soft spoken. Are you sure you're tough enough to do this? Or do people, he didn't say, are you tough enough? He said, do people ask you, you know, are some people asking you if you're tough enough to do this? And I said, well, considering I'm a former Navy helicopter pilot and a former federal prosecutor, I assume they know I am. And he said, oh yeah, right. And I said, thanks for the question. So, you know, I think that that gave me the ability to talk about my kids and to talk about soccer practice and to talk about how hellish homeschooling your child is, because people know that I'm tough enough to go into this. And so I can be my authentic self. I can connect. I don't have to put on this bravado that you know, I'm just this tough person all the time and I never laugh and I never crack a smile. I can really, I think, connect better with voters with that resume. Now, I will say, I think it's all changed. I think with so many women that were successful, and now the country seeing so many women in these offices, that there is not as much of a preconceived notion of what a politician should look like, which I think has opened so many doors for women to be more authentic, just in general, which is fantastic.
I think it's important to know that, I mean, it's not, it's not that secret, but I mean, these female veterans are Democrats, right? I mean, let's be clear about where this experience and where these values lie. And it happens to be in our party. And I think that's important to note because, you know, we're talking about service, but we also have seen just how dangerous the remarks of somebody like this president can be when they're used for nefarious purposes and not the true national security of our country. I think it's also, you know, it's women, you know, having this particular background, talking about our values, but it's also Democrats having that, right? I think too often Democrats have not been willing to talk about national security or lead on that for whatever reason. So I think there's a couple of benefits there.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. We've seen a different conversation around national security from Democrats. And certainly the ways in which the conversation around women's leadership has opened up has been really, I mean, it makes space for so many different kinds of people. It's not like you have to be one particular kind of way. And so I look forward to seeing many, many more Congresswomen who have all kinds of backgrounds, who have military service, who have national security backgrounds, who do all kinds of different things, and feeling like that's open for all kinds of women, that there's not just one way of being there. We try to keep these Zooms short because everyone's suffering from Zoom fatigue and we're all about to spend 3 hours watching the convention tonight. But I just want to say This has been such an inspiring conversation with the two of you. I hope all of our participants have enjoyed it as much as I have. I feel so much more hopeful about the future of America at a time when it's really hard, you know, like watching Michelle Obama last night. We think we all feel how hard this moment is and how bleak it looks and how much is really on the line. I'm very excited for the two of you to be able to serve together in Congress. And hopefully being able to have you both on again as National Security Congresswoman, both of you, come January. But thank you so much for spending this time with us, and wish you both all the best in this election and in guiding our country through these difficult times. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Mieke. So great seeing you, Gina. Take care.
Thanks, guys.